Well, good morning, Life Group leaders. Our lesson today is going to be lesson 11, and it's going to cover the beginning of the book of Titus. Now, I'm not teaching this week, but I get the honor of sharing some thoughts with you on how I would handle the lesson if I were teaching. And my hope is maybe it'll help you as you study and pray about some of the things that God wants you to bring out to your class. Now, there's no doubt that Paul wrote the letter. One of the questions that come up, though, is when did he write it? And in all probability, the letter to Titus was written between Paul's two imprisonments. After being released from house arrest, Paul did some traveling. Where all he went, we're not sure. But we have a sense that he visited Ephesus, and he left Timothy there to help the church. Then he went to Macedonia, and he wrote 1 Timothy. Then he visited Crete, which is in the Mediterranean Sea, southeast of Greece, north of Africa, and then he left Titus there. Then the idea is probably that he went to Greece, and when he went to Greece, he wrote Titus. And then he was rearrested, and then we know that he was martyred for the gospel of Jesus Christ. I want to try and maybe help you begin to study and to teach this marvelous book. Because at first it might seem that this is very redundant, because in a general sense we just got through with 1 Timothy, and they might at least seem to be alike. And in a general sense there really are. And generally Paul is aging. He knows that his life is beginning to end. He's trying to establish the churches. He's handing off the baton to his young sons in the faith. And also in a general sense, he is encouraging these young pastors. He's wanting them to appoint mature and godly leaders. He is wanting them to deal strongly with false believers. And then he is wanting the church to function correctly. And so there may be a sense as you begin reading and studying the letter to Titus, you may think, deja vu, here we go again. How are we going to keep from sounding stale? Well, let me give you something to chew on. For me, I think it's important that there's several things we can note in our study of Titus. First of all, who is he writing to? Because Timothy and Titus were different in their temperaments, and some of Paul's writing will reflect that. So as you work through and study through the book for your lessons, be looking for how he addresses Titus as opposed to how he addressed Timothy. Also, where was the church located and what was going on in the church? And while the big idea is false teachers, as you study, you will notice there's somewhat different issues. Therefore, in Bible study, it's important to focus on not so much every big issue as much as the specific words that are used to combat false teaching. Words are very important because it makes the Bible specific. So what I try to do when I teach or preach, I try to take apart words, and then I try to connect the words to the situation that caused Paul to write the letter in the first place. Now, if I was teaching, I may not go this route, but I think it's important for all of us to know that words have authority, and words have power, and words can be awfully encouraging, but words can be also discouraging. And so Paul's going to address that to Timothy beginning in verse 10, that words have power, and we have to be careful with what we say, and especially how we say it. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean about looking at specific words and why that's important and helps keep studies and lessons and sermons fresh. In verse 1, Paul describes himself as a servant of God, literally a God slave. This is the only place where Paul describes himself this way. In two other places, he will use this term, a servant of Christ. But why in this letter does he use the term God's slave, only here? Well, if you were to look at verse 10, you would find that most of the false teachers were Jews. Paul will write it this way: those of the circumcision, which is a reference to Jews or Judaizers, and I'll mention that a little bit later. Now, why would Paul use this term? Well, perhaps Paul wants to establish his apostolic authority all the way back to Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel, especially if he wants Titus to challenge Jewish false leaders in the church. So this is an example of how specific words are important and helps keep the Bible study fresh. It's just a good way to do it. Titus's primary opponents were Jewish. Hey, it flavors the letter all the way through, and so we need to be reminded of that. Now, if I were teaching the lesson, it would be at this point. I would bring out some of that other to help set the stage, the foundation of the study. But then I would read verses 1 through 5. And I think it's really neat how Paul phrases what he's writing the letter for. In verses 1 and 2, Paul uses 3 foundational truths that can be brought out about salvation. Now, there's a lot of terms that apply to our salvation, isn't there? Terms like adoption, like regeneration, ransom, all of those kinds of things. But yet when you take the doctrine of salvation and you bring it down to its basic terms, there are 3 terms that are used: justification, sanctification, and glorification. And I think this is what Paul is aiming for, because the false teachers were Jews called Judaizers. So, first of all, justification. Notice he says, faith of those chosen of God. Your translation may have the word elect. And while that term can be challenging to some, it simply here refers to God's people. God chooses his own out of his grace and mercy, rather than because they have achieved some level of holiness on their own, by their own merit or performance, which is what the Judaizers taught. To the Judaizers, it wasn't grace alone, it was Jesus plus something. And so justification is a declaration by God that his people have been declared not guilty, and this declaration is based solely upon the gift of his grace and never of human work. And so what Paul is doing is directing his letter through Titus to God's people that anytime anybody adds anything to salvation, then they're teaching heresy. Then he mentions knowledge of the truth. That is sanctification. After a person is declared not guilty, what does God do? Well, he begins a process of holiness, and it begins with knowing truth, then applying and living truth in our lives. Gospel truth can be seen, and gospel truth can be heard in a life. And Paul will attack the false teachers and challenge Titus to attack the false teachers because of what they say. The tongue has power, remember, and how they live. He's referring to their motives, why they say, why they do what they do. And I think one of the greatest challenges in the church is to help people see and then live their lives based upon truth, not based upon opinion or even desire. And then he'll mention in, I think, verse 2, the hope of eternal life. We call that glorification. The deepest longing for a believer is to one day see Christ, live his life now, and in eternity in the security of this truth. I tell you, I don't want to base my eternity upon Tom's performance. I want to base my eternity in the security I have on Christ's performance, and knowing at just the right time, God promised it, and God accomplished it, and Paul tells Timothy, God cannot lie. What a great opening to a letter that at first might seem so redundant, but it's not at all. Now, after this great opening of our lesson writer shifts to the challenge and that is verses 10 through 16. Now I'm going to kind of deal with this in try to answer some questions, okay? Who were they that he was supposed to challenge? Well, I mentioned to you the circumcision. It seems the majority in the church were Jewish people who added to salvation Jewish legalistic rules and observances. Now, they were lost because, as I said before, anytime you add anything, no matter what it is, to Christ, you're teaching heresy. Verse 14 mentions myths, commandments of men, and basically what these false teachers would do, they would take Old Testament truths and they would twist them for their own use. Question number 2, why would they do that? Well, verse 11 tells us they were doing it for their own sordid gain. Now, the term sordid generally refers to finances, but I think it also could include authority and power. There are always those in the church that want the power, and they always try to use people to accomplish that. Notice Paul says that they were empty talkers and deceivers. They just kept talking without saying anything of substance, and their manner is really not in the church or in public, but in homes or smaller groups. In the homes or smaller groups, it'd be easier for people to be intimidated, and also they were out of the ear range of those in authority who would call them out. And in doing so, what they wanted to do was gain an advantage over others to increase their pockets or to have some agenda that benefits them. Now, what does Paul say? Well, Paul says to Titus, silence them. Then he says, reprove them severely. Now, the hope, obviously, is that they will come to become sound in faith, which should always be our desire. But I tell you, Paul's a realist, because in verse 16, he clearly says they don't even belong to the faith. They may profess by their deeds, talk and action, but in reality, they deny Christ. They are detestable, he says. They're disobedient. They're worthless. Tough words, but needed words because of the heresy that was being set forth in the church. All of these words are worthy of exploring. However, time may prevent, and the discussion you want to have may prevent defining all of them, but I want to throw out one or two for you to consider. I mentioned the words earlier, empty talkers. This is one word in the original, and it means they just talk without any substance, any depth, any biblical reality or biblical authority. We might say they talk out of the side of their mouths to gain an advantage. They do it by deceiving others, and this word means to mislead the mind. And so what they do, they hit the thinking part of the brain, and they twist discernment so that they can accomplish whatever their ungodly motives are. And so Paul tells Titus, silence them, literally put a muzzle on them. And he says, Titus, you got to do this severely. Sharply convict them. Now, when you work through all of our verses for our lesson, golly, you can see there's a lot of material here, and it's all fresh, and it's different than what Paul wrote to Timothy. And if we had time, we could mention even one of their prophets, Epimenides, that's mentioned here, his philosophy. I just don't know that you're going to have time. If I was teaching, I probably wouldn't get past the first verse, okay? So you're just going to have to decide what to keep, what to throw away. However, be sure to bring out that ministering in a church, in whatever role anyone may play, is not for the ease of heart, because we're dealing in spiritual matters. We are called to truth, and it's not easy, especially since we are imperfect ourselves and we're very fallible individuals. Every church has their challenges, and as long as the Lord tarries his return, it just kind of comes with the territory. But it's so worth it. I think Titus is going to be a good study. I think that there's a lot of material here, especially the words and the phrases and who's he's talking to. And the church that's made up of mainly Jewish heresy teachers, to give you a lot of good study and a lot of opportunities for some great discussion. So anyway, I'm not teaching this week, but I'm sure glad I got to study the lesson and glad I got to share it with you, and I hope you enjoyed. God bless you. I'm excited about the fall and what the Lord's going to do.